Today, I want to welcome Alan Keate. I've known Alan for several years now. And the interesting thing is, when I first met Alan, my when I knew just what his business was, I was like, I'm not sure I want to do business with him. But as I got to know Alan's heart, I was like, this is exactly who I want to do business with. And so this is going to be an interesting episode. You're going to hear some things that may surprise you, but I want you to approach it with an open mind because there are needs in this world that need to be met. And whatever we do, as we look to meet those needs, the heart behind the person meeting those needs is so important. And Alan is one of these people that has a good heart and seeks to bring out the best in everybody that he works with. And that's why I'm excited to have him here on Leaders and Legacies. Alan, welcome.
Thanks, Craig. I appreciate that. You're Well, we were talking just a minute ago. I mean, you can appreciate. Look, heart is great, and I appreciate the compliment. I really do. But your greatest strength is your greatest weakness, right? Like we were just discussing a moment ago.
Yeah. Well, we'll get
Like,
in. Yeah, and we'll get into that in a minute. But so um, I guess kind of as a high level, whatever you've done, wherever you've been in your career,
yeah.
you've worked in the space of providing debt, brokering debt or, giving credit or
hmm
buying credit. And that seems to be kind of the constant theme throughout throughout your career. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, actually, yeah. My some of my background comes from like public markets, specifically like equity options and things. And there's kind of a debt component to that because it looks at those models, if you will, look at the cost of capital and the cost of money through time. So yeah, interest rates and things like that. Yeah. I actually never thought about that until you just said it.
Well, and for those listening, I think the thing that you want to listen to is, if you're in business, at some point you're probably going to need some type of, debt as a vehicle. And so we're
Okay.
going to get into we're going to get into what Alan's doing right now a little bit later. But, for me, part of my own story goes back more than 20 years. And one of my best friends is a guy named Ulrich Madsen. And he's a very talented engineer that moved to the United States. And for those that haven't experienced this, there's a unique challenge. When you move to the United States, it doesn't matter what you did in Denmark, where he was from, your credit rating is blank in the US.
Yeah.
And here he is, he's a well paid, talented engineer who can't get a car loan.
Yeah. The 18-year-old can get one a lot easier than he could.
Why is that?
I mean, unfortunately, people just look at um, recent history in the US and they're looking at, what has been their propensity to pay in the past. And when you have they call them a no file or a thin file, for somebody who's kind of a ghost in the system, and they get a lot less credit than an 18-year-old incoming freshman who just got 30 credit card offers in his box, right? Um, and that kid is going to get a credit card well before because he's had a social. Um, his parents have, filed that, they have access to it, and that shows up differently in credit files than someone who has an immigrant or some other type of social, and they can kind of tell the difference when those were issued. So, the first few numbers of mine say that mine was issued a long time ago, almost 50 years ago. So theirs is going to say that it was just issued. So that becomes the problem with that particular social, and therefore access to credit that you and I use every day, they just don't have.
Yeah. Well, and what ended up happening to him was a colleague, uh, I think at one point he considered a friend, sold him a heap of junk. It was a Ford Contour that was such a dog that when he moved back to Denmark, he just abandoned it in the company parking lot. And I'm not sure whatever happened to that car, but it was so worthless. He just left it. He just abandoned it and moved back to Denmark. But it that was part of the challenge, and that was a part of the world that you lived in.
Yeah.
Is you helped you helped people with bad credit or no credit get cars.
Yeah. Yeah, we did. We did it in a number of different iterations, whether it was the actual physical dealerships that created the notes or moved on to, well, that's one way to do it, is be the dealer and originate them. Another is be an indirect finance company. So at the point of sale, someone goes to a dealership, you're the finance company that they pick to kind of take the loan. Or most recently, we did bulk purchasing of notes in the space. So kind of the secondary market. When people finance cars, it takes a lot of capital. They run out of capital. They want to continue to finance cars. What do? They offload those to another lender. And in that case, that's who we were in the latest iteration. So
Yeah, and the lingo is what buy here, pay here.
yeah, buy here, pay here. That kind of encompasses a lot of things, but yeah, definitely dealing with, everyone would like to think that buy here, pay here only deals with, subprime consumers, but the reality you just described, your buddy who, if he would have financed a car from Denmark, he would have been classified as subprime, but the reality is he was absolutely prime, right?
Yeah.
So just because you've been classified that way doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you are as a consumer from a lending perspective.
Well, and that's the thing I was mentioning at the introduction is when I first saw that, I was like, I had some misunderstandings about the buy here, pay here space. I was like,
Mhm.
I don't know if I want to be associated with that. But as I got to know you and as I got to learn your heart, um, I, one of the things that really hit me was there's a real need. There is a need out there, and that made me think back to my buddy Ulrich.
Yeah.
But it's not just high paid engineers. There's a lot of people. One of the stats that you shared with me, and this of course has changed since interest rates went up,
Mhm.
but this was what for this was 2020ish.
Yeah. 4 or 5 years
Um,
ago.
yeah, and we were having lunch, and you just pointed out to the street. We were sitting out in the patio of uh, that salad place that you like to go to.
Yes.
And you just pointed at the street and you said one out of every five cars that you see out there has a double digit note on it.
Yeah.
And that was back when interest rates were basically nothing.
Yeah. And now even the prime guys are almost paying double digits, right?
Yeah. And
Um,
that surprised me. Why is that?
why do people move? Well, I mean, really, our borrowers fall into really two general categories. Borrowers in subprime generally, they really fall into two categories. One would be situational, and I'll give you an example of that here in just a minute. And the other is going to be generational. So situational, take my story. Out of college and out of um, basically early in my working career, I started a life settlement and viaticals company. Uh, again, lending against really life insurance, and unwanted life insurance policies. Viaticals is a little bit different than a life settlement, but nonetheless, you're lending against insurance. And I found myself basically at the end of the first startup experience, entrepreneur travels, I found myself divorced, lost the business, and basically didn't have any money. Um, Lost everything. I think at one point I was sleeping on my brother's couch, and I needed a car to get to work. And, I made some phone calls and realized my credit score was not what it needed to be to do that. And so I actually had to buy a car from, I mean, I was lucky enough that my parents kind of helped me with a car, but my only real options were buy here, pay here. So I would have to put it down and pay those double digit interest rates. Now, obviously, the situation is different now. Um, but in order to get to that point, I rode the bus and and the train, and I did all the public transportation things to get to a job so that I could buy a car. And that would be a situation, right? Unfortunate circumstances, bad things happen to good people all the time. And sometimes we move up and down the credit spectrum. So that's situational. That's why it is. Situations happen, medical, unemployment, maybe an unexpected expense of significant size, and that can mean different things to different people. And then there's just the generational. It's just habit, right? It's what my uncle and my cousin and my brother all do, and that's just where we buy our cars and how we do it.
Yeah.
That's really why that market segment is so big. I mean, think about all the macroeconomic pressure right now on the consumer, and you're going to see a lot of people moving down the credit spectrum before they move back up.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that really impressed me about you was you'd launched a program to try to get people from paying double digits, which now is kind of standard, but back then it wasn't. But to get people from paying double digits on their car loan to use that to rebuild their credit and um and then be able to get, better rates. And how did that work out?
Yeah, that was my thesis. My thesis was that we could make, maybe is the way I approached it. We could make a better consumer in our space. So that was my original theory. My original theory was what we should do is tie economic incentives to consumer behavior in our portfolio. And so what we did is, as we accumulated loans and brought loans in, we did a link and a campaign back to a consumer finance literacy program. And we said, if we can educate people on how expensive this is to be here in this credit spectrum, that the behavior would change. As the level of education that they had about interest and rates and yields and things like that, as their education level and as they became more educated, they would be able to move across spectrums, and they would be able to move up. That would do two things for us as a company. And we would do one thing for them. And what we would do for them is knock down their interest rate. They needed to pay on time for a period of time. They needed to complete the financial literacy program that would kind of educate them about this. And then we would incentivize them by dropping their interest rate. The other thing that they had to do was actually take care of their car, right?
Mm-hmm.
They needed to change the oil and do the things that you're supposed to do to make sure that your assets survive the life of the loan. What we found is that was wildly unsuccessful. No one really logged in or took the time to complete the literacy program to move up the credit spectrum. Why? I have theories, but I don't have any concrete. In fact, out of millions and millions of dollars worth of loans, I only ever had one person do it.
Wow. That's so sad.
It is sad, and I wish I could go back and figure out the why. Maybe they didn't understand it. We didn't communicate the incentives. What we tried to say is, for every point off your rate, it's pretty significant and healthy savings. Um, I mean, even those of us in a prime sector now, I mean, we feel the pinch on cars and consumer loans being priced from 3% up to now 8.5. I mean, that's significant difference. That's probably on a $10,000 car, that's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars a year. And those hundreds of dollars can pay insurance, can pay kids' expenses, kids' medical expenses, help with school fees or whatever. But nobody ever took us up on it. And that was disappointing to me, because literally that was the main thesis of my finance company, indirect finance company.
Yeah. It's funny when you're sitting there talking about that, and you're like, the frustration of, you know, trying to inspire better behavior, hoping for better behavior, and them just not getting it. I don't know why. You know what popped in my head
Hmm.
was the mortgage crisis of 2008,
Yeah.
and the banks, the bankers that engaged in bad behavior,
Yeah.
and they haven't changed their behavior.
No, they've repackaged CDOs as something else now.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
and so, in some ways it's easy to say, well, to look at this behavior and say it's something of a, particular class of people, but we see elements of that across the spectrum, that it was just grossly irresponsible behavior. It nearly took down the world economy. It cost Americans, you know, I don't even know how to quantify it. I could say trillions, but I think I think it's an insane amount of money that we're still paying the price for, and will continue to.
Yeah.
But it didn't change the behavior.
No. I mean, I thought, and looking at cars, like there was, with our program, like there were only two outcomes. And this is kind of goes back to that thesis. It was pay your note on time and move up the credit spectrum, and we'll help you refinance your vehicle with someone else at a lower rate, or lower your rate in-house and just kind of creep that down, because risk is return is a function of risk. And so if someone proves to me that they can pay something, they're not as big a risk as, say, someone with a newly originated note. But what you also find in doing this indirect finance is that, on the one hand, we offered a reward, and the reward was uh, financial incentives, less cash outlay, better rate. The other side is, don't pay your note and your car gets repossessed. Well, only one person made it through to the end and got their rates lowered. Yet I repossessed a lot of cars. So are people more motivated? Oh, by the way, and I had people that redeemed the repossession, right? So depends on the state you're in, but a lot of times if your car is repossessed, the lender has the ability to either call the note, or can be made whole if you make all the back payments, or they can even offer you a settlement, right? You owe me $1,500. If you pay me $1,000, we'll reset your loan and we'll start again. Because there's like a misconception that everyone thinks that if you repo a car, you make money. That's not true. I mean, our average loss was probably around 7,000 if you had to repossess a car. So that's a fallacy. That's not even the truth.
Well, because
But
a repossessed car is kind of like a repossessed house. They've ripped out the microwave. The place is a wreck.
right. The car is a mess. I mean, it's full of McDonald's or whatever.
Yeah.
McDonald's that it got thrown over the seat, and now 4 years later and it's still there. So petrified French fries are a real thing. But yeah, that is that's rough, because then you start talking about is the consumer more motivated by opportunity, and the chance to make their life better, or on the other hand, getting it repossessed, they must be more motivated by fear, right? So the fear of loss over here is more of an incentive, and more borrowers found themselves on that end of the spectrum than actually trying to help themselves and be proactive in trying to reduce their overhead.
Yeah.
I mean, fear's a real thing.
Well, let's kind of switch gears and let's talk about businesses, because
Yeah.
I would I would suspect that there's some of that behavior where businesses take out loans, they get to a point where they just go bankrupt. They're like, okay, I'm screwed. I can't make this go, and restart. What's so because right now you're now with Lexington Advisors, and you're helping people with their capital needs. What advice would you give to businesses as they approach debt, as they think about debt?
Yeah, I would be very cognizant of the cost of the capital you're taking on. Um, and I think one of the biggest problems that we saw, or I've seen in auto spaces, is two things. One, they took on as much debt as they could because it was cheap, right? I think the real response to that question needs to be, please only take on as much debt as you should. Just because you can doesn't mean that you should. And so that's what I've really seen with, why I jumped into this. I mean, my biggest challenge as a business owner and as a founder, or as a turnaround CEO, I've done that. Really, for me, is where do I get this debt, and how does it affect my cap stack, and how does it affect my cash flow? And that's really what led me to this, is because I became real frustrated. There aren't a lot of great sources. Even Google, for all its infinite ability, it's not going to help you put together, hey, fund A is better than company B, or bank B is better than company A. And so that's what I want to do, is help educate them. And especially when they take on debt, advise them and say, look, how much do you need? I know you want all of it. You want to build a 100, $200 million company. That's great. But how much should you have based on your underlying assets?
Yeah. What what are some common mistakes that you see people falling into? I mean, obviously taking on more debt than they need. What are some other things?
Particularly in business, I would say the other big mistake that I see, and I've made it myself. So don't, don't, I am not immune. I am not immune. I have made my own mistakes and things. A lot of times I think that they're not paying attention to the P&L. They're not paying attention to the balance sheet. They're not understanding what levers they have to pull with their own business. I think they spend a lot of time working in the business, like in it. I'm going to go collect on this account, or I'm going to go work with my managers and hitting their KPIs, or whatever the case may be, instead of maybe taking a step back and saying, I'm going to work on my business. So let me look at it from a 10,000-foot view, so I can see all the trees and now understand how all these pieces, I don't think they do that very well. I think a lot of times they listen to their peers that may or may not. I mean, it's the car business indirectly, and the fish get bigger every time they catch them, right? They're car guys. So the fish went from 12 inches to 36 inches. And I don't think that that always gives them their best advice. But,
Yeah.
when I'm there trying to say, listen, your advance rate on your warehouse facility needs to be 55. And they say, well, but Bob got 80. Well, maybe. But what you didn't understand is, he leaned every piece of property from here to, San Antonio. So you just don't know. It's not always apples to oranges. The stories change. I would say do your due diligence. Pay attention to your balance sheet. Um, Lenders care about balance sheets. You care about the income statement. Lenders are going to care about the balance sheet. And so make sure you understand balance sheet.
Yeah. And, certainly for me, and I imagine for a lot of business owners, there's a lot of that's just like, it's not interesting. It's kind of gobbledygook. Um,
Yeah.
I know it's important, but I don't care. What would you recommend to people, for somebody that's like that? Because most, a lot of business owners, they, in the mid-sized businesses, uh, they got into what they're doing because they were passionate about what they did, and they were able to grow their business because they were passionate. They're, you know, probably not a CFO by nature.
Right.
What would you advise to them so they could figure out what could they do as sort of like, I went to Camp Gladiator this morning to work on my physical body, to get physically healthier,
Yeah.
and stronger. What would you recommend they do so they could, be financially stronger to approach somebody like you, when they need capital?
Yeah, I think first is understand the basic premise of income statements, balance sheets, and cash flow statements. Um, you I think years and years ago they had those, you know, financial statements for dummies.
Hmm.
I mean, and I know that sounds bad, but it's still a reference book that I have. Um, in case I look at something and I'm like, don't get that. So trying to understand some of the relationships. I would also get an accountant that you trust.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of business owners get smacked pretty hard by accountants that maybe aren't as ethical as they need to be. And then thirdly would be join a peer group, right? Whether it's business general peer group where you have a diversified base of members in a group that have different businesses and different types of businesses. That's one. And I think that gives you pretty good perspective on business generally. And then maybe even something like a dealership group or something. And there's a bunch of them out there, and join a group and start to be challenged. I mean, I think part of the issue is when you're sitting at the top and you're the top of a finance company or the food chain, if you will, you, you may run out of peers and friends that you grew up with college or high school or business, that you may have got outgrown them. And so their advice is maybe no longer relevant. And those groups can be a good place where you can be challenged on what your thesis is, when you offer investor education to or financial literacy to consumers, is it going to change their behavior? Maybe if I'd have been in a group back then, they would have challenged me and been like, hey, it's not going to work. We've done this. You should probably save your millions of dollars. Now, we didn't lose money, but it certainly didn't work as well as I thought.
Yeah.
So,
So real quick, now you're with Lexan Advisors, and what
yeah,
what do they do?
we help people with their capital needs, both from a debt perspective and on the debt that really falls into two categories. One is senior debt. The other would be junior or mezzanine or bridge debt. And then equity. We can raise equity for groups. And we have a box we like to look at, right? I think that anybody that has, of a certain size, we really can't help them. They're going to have to use like their local banks and resources. But once it gets bigger, then we come in and we can help syndicate those loans if we need to syndicate them, or we can find funds or little alternative areas that really are looking for exposure to this asset class in the auto space.
And so you said once they reach a certain level, what level?
Yeah, you probably need to have a portfolio north of 5 million, probably 10. And you think that that's hard. And it is hard to get there. And I appreciate the blood, sweat, and tears that it takes to get there. But I will also say that, when you're financing cars at 20, 25 grand a pop, it doesn't take long to get there either.
Oh, cool. Well, how would somebody reach you? Let's say they're at that 5 or 10 million or higher. How do they find you? How do they connect?
Yeah, feel free to find me on LinkedIn, or just Keate, Akeate at lexinadvisors.com. They could email me. I'm fairly responsive. I'm not Pavlov's dog yet that, ring the bell, but it's pretty close. My wife doesn't like it, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, excellent. Well, Alan, thanks for sharing this. And again, I just want to thank you for being in my life, because as the heart that, your heart that drives what you do has been such an encouragement to me. And um, and I appreciate you sharing that with folks on Leaders and Legacies today.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me, letting me do this. Um, I like to help people. I mean, by nature, I'm a people pleaser. Um, and I get a lot of enjoyment out of watching others have success. I think there's enough bad things in this world. We should cheer each other on. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right. Thanks, Craig.